much. And now I'm going to hand over to Marcus Oxley, who's going to look at the international perspective in particular.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Right. Okay, let's just... just a quick introduction, because there's a lot of new faces here for me. I don't actually get invited to speak to domestic UK audiences, because most of my work is international. For the last 30 years, I've worked internationally on issues of risk and resilience. So I'm going to share some of that with you. But just as a little, it's great to actually be here, because I am actually from the north of England. I'm a Yorkshireman. I was born and bred in Yorkshire. I did a degree apprenticeship in the National Coal Board, as it was then, the state coal mining industry. I actually studied at the University of Manchester over 30 years ago, so it's great to be back here. And then after the miners' strike, the industry contracted, and I went to work overseas. That was what prompted me in many ways. The silver cloud in every grey storm or whatever, it prompted me to go overseas. And I've ended up working on issues of climate adaptation, resilience. My former background is very politically incorrect to say that I actually worked in the deep coal mining industry, but it's funny how it all kind of, your journey goes, isn't it? Anyway, I'm going to share with you some insights that I've learned about risk and resilience over the years, and some of the challenges that we face and some of the opportunities that we face, and it is a lot to do with my international experience. And what I would say that I realize the context is different, and context in many ways in everything, but I do believe there is transferable knowledge, that there is value to what is happening here, to the work that I'm doing, but also the work that I'm doing with the UN and various organizations. I believe there's relevance here as well. And I often feel that the issues, particularly in lower income countries, are perhaps a little bit more black and white, a bit more stark than what they are here. But I often say, if you want to understand the grey, then you have to see the black and the white, and particularly the lack of resources that there are in lower income countries make the whole significance of whole of society engagement very, very important, because there just isn't the capacities and the resources within the government to actually, decentralize and provide that local level capacity. So the heavy lifting, if you like, in building resilience, in managing risk, is often done by the primary bearers of risk, which are affected communities. So, there is some relevance here, I think. Okay, well, we all use this expression, whole of society. I was when I was asked to present here, I thought, well, I'll see if I can find a bit of a standard definition. But everybody's got their own definition of what it all means. The one UN agency has got this, another UN. We all use it. All these different frameworks, and it's a fundamental principle within the UK government framework. I mean, excellent. It's a guiding principle in the Sendai framework, which is the global blueprint, if you like, as to how the world is going to prevent disasters, reduce disaster. And it's captured in the SDGs, in the climate agreement, in the new urban agenda. So everybody's using this phrase. So I thought what I'll do is I'll just pull out what I think some of the core principles are, rather than trying to look at different definitions. And I think this is what it's about, really. It's about this issue of inclusivity. It's about, we call it, internationally, we call this leaving no one behind. I think that is the levelling up agenda. I think that's partly to do with that. It recognizes that it's actually a joint endeavor. It requires collaboration, partnership, shared responsibilities, accountabilities. It's about empowering. It's about bringing people into decision and planning making processes in a meaningful way. And that's particularly, as I say, significant in lower income countries, because ultimately it's the people on the ground that have to use their sources of resilience, their capacities, their knowledge to actually strengthen societal resilience. And I think it's actually just a good governance principle. You know, when I work, to me, it's around risk governance. It's about good risk governance, and these are the core principles there. And I do think it is, this whole of society approach is partly, it builds that society. If we believe that society is a good, positive endeavor, then the way we build resilience and the processes that we use can actually strengthen that society. The way that this government engages with its counterparts in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England, do that together, we are stronger together, and we build society together. So there's a lots of, and so it's important. It's important because you've got to we all say we've got to understand risk. It's kind of like step one, understand risk. But, whose perspective are you trying to understand risk from? We should be trying to understand it from the primary bearer of that risk. And they will have a different perception than somebody who is not bearing that same risk. So if we feel this is about inclusion, and it's about leveling up, and it's about bringing people into the process, then we need to make sure that we understand these different perspectives. And then how do we negotiate in society and reach consensus as to what that acceptable level of risk is? We can never eliminate all risk, as I'll explain, but it is about, it is an essential part of building society, of building societal resilience. It is a genuine whole of society approach. So, okay, let me just kind of, give you some thoughts on risk because, obviously this is a context. Global risk is increasing. It's increasing in virtually every country around the world. When I came into this work, there was a big push towards negotiating what was called the Hyogo framework. This was negotiated in 2005. It was negotiated by the UN. The UK government was one of the countries that adopted that framework. And the aspirational goal of the Hyogo framework, a 10-year framework, was going to be a substantial reduction in disaster losses. 10 years later, in 2015, when the UN reported back to the member states at the World Conference, they said, actually, we haven't seen a substantial reduction. We've seen a substantial increase in disaster losses. So we're going in the opposite direction that we're trying to get to. So the UN then said, okay, discussions with the member states, we need to have a new framework. It was negotiated in the province of Sendai in Japan. That's why it's called the Sendai framework. Except this time, we gave ourselves a 15-year time frame. The same objective, a substantial reduction in disaster losses by the end of the framework compared to the baseline at the start of the framework. So by 2030, we'll have seen the last midterm review, which was last year in Bali. I was there. The UN reported, actually, the way progress is going, we're actually going to see a 40% increase in disaster losses by the end of the 2030 timeframe. In other words, we are heading towards a substantial increase in disaster losses at the end of that 15-year timeframe. So our risk is growing, and it's all over the world. And the critical issue is, nobody is denying we're not making progress in disaster risk reduction. Nobody is saying we're not making progress. Undoubtedly we are. The problem is we are creating risk faster than we're able to actually manage that risk. So the critical issue is around the prevention issue, as we heard about earlier. Yes, we need to get better prepared for existing risks within the system, but the critical challenge is, how do we stop that prevention of risk? That is the critical issue. I'm just going to have a drink of water. Yeah, sorry. Okay, let's just keep going. I hope it's relevant to what you're doing. I know it's a bit, I've probably used different language to what you guys use, but, hey ho. Now, the risk is what we call multidimensional and systemic. So this is the thing. Our risks actually are now starting to be systemic within our system, and different parts of risk are compounding and driving other risks. So we call it this multidimensional systemic risk, and we've got key drivers like, our degradation of our environment, our land use changes are massively contributing. We're losing what we call our ecosystem services, which can regulate and moderate and absorb extreme shocks and stresses and provide protection. We're experiencing clear. Every single headline is, hottest year of the decade or hottest month of the year, wettest. I was in the Philippines a month ago. They are having 7 super cyclones so far this year. A super cyclone used to happen once every 20 years. So the frequency and intensity, magnitude of these investments is massively increasing, and that's happening all over the world. It'll happen, and it impacts across food systems, energy systems, and our water security systems. So these whole issues, we get spikes in our food prices, in our energy prices, cost of living crises. All these issues are all interlinked. So we can't deal with it through any specific typology of risk management. It has to be a collaborative partnership endeavor. So multidimensional risk has to be managed through collective joint working. And this is why this whole of governments, whole of society, whole of system approach that we heard is so important. And, and risk also, although it has to be managed locally because it is configured and therefore has to be managed locally. Now, I use this slide just an example of what I mean by that, because clearly what you can see here, these are the examples of the COVID infection levels during the pandemic here in the UK. And clearly the risk profile in London is very different to the risk profile in, say, Northern Ireland or in southwest England. It's a different risk profile because the exposure levels are massively different. The exposure level in inner London, when people are on crowded public transport systems, is massively different to people who live in remoter parts of the country. But also the vulnerability is different. In London, you've got a relatively young demographic. Okay, there's lots of people, but there's a lot of young people there. Now, that demographic is very different, say, in Cornwall or Somerset. So you haven't got the same level of exposure, but your demographic is a lot more elderly people living in that particular county. So these risk profiles depend and are configured locally. So this is not a one-size-fits-all that we're going to, everybody this is, we shall say at the global level or the national level how this is managed. We have to empower the local actors to recognize what their local risk dynamics are and decide what the local appropriate actions and measures are needed. Ultimately, that's how we have to manage this. So again, it's about empowering, building the capacity, engaging. We use this term cascading. I heard it earlier today, actually, about cascading and compound. Again, there's lots of different definitions. Here's my simple understanding of what cascading and compounding risk. Cascading is when it, splits out and goes out into other risks, drops down. We often use what's called impact chain analysis as a tool to help us to understand this. And when it mutually reinforces, it compounds. So there's a kind of synergy, if you like. So our risk can kind of exponentially grow. The interesting thing there is, if we get the solution right, actually our benefits can exponentially compound and cascade as well. So there's a food for thought. And of course, when it reaches levels that it's impacting in terms of our economic systems or our environmental systems or our social systems, we develop a framework. We develop a disaster prevention framework, the DRR framework. We've got a problem with climatic change, so we develop a Paris Climate Agreement, etc., etc. So we have a response system. It responds to symptoms which our inappropriate development pathway is actually creating. The critical issue is our development paradigm. Yeah, that's what's driving this. So the issue then is about how do we change and how do we reconfigure that development paradigm? Yes, there's risk in the system. We have to get better prepared, better response, better recovery. But if you want to get ahead of the curve, you've got to get to grips with that prevention, creation of risk agenda. And that's inherently a development agenda, sector development, territorial development, land use planning. That's the critical issue. And of course, we need to recognize that risk is inherently part of our system. This is not about how do we eliminate risk. If we wanted to live in a total risk-free world, we'd just live in a concrete bunker. We wouldn't leave our house. You can't. It's about what is an acceptable level of risk that a society is prepared to take. What's the risk tolerance? I think was a word somebody used earlier. So it's inherent in our development processes, and risk is inherently can have positive attributes as well as negative attributes. In the disaster management world, inherently, when we talk about risk, we talk about the risk of adverse consequences. Talk to a business community, they talk about risk in relation to reward. They see risk as an opportunity. So it's about how to understand how to capitalize on that risk as an opportunity. We need to get better at understanding what sort of risk and how do we benefit from risk, as well as not just trying to react to risk. So this is the equation that the UN has for risk reduction. It's about, first of all, how do you minimize the creation of risk? How do you reduce existing risk? And then how do you manage residual risk? Residual risk is about risk transfer mechanisms. It's about, they call it compensatory risk management. It's about insurance mechanisms, that type of thing. Most of the effort globally in DRR is around reducing existing risk. It's about how do we get better prepared, how do we get better response, how do we recover. That's existing risk, and they do that because we can reduce the impact of that. But the critical issue, and the one where we're making least progress, is actually around the prevention or minimizing the creation of risk. So there lies the challenge. How do we get that? And of course, what we need to recognize is that development is driving the risk that we're seeing. So we need to shift that and make sure that we are understanding the risk in our development planning, in our development decision-making processes. That's the critical issue. So what do we do at the moment? The world says, okay, we've got a problem with climate change, so we'll have a climate agreement. We negotiate that at the global level. It's then turned into national climate change adaptation mitigation plans. Then you go into local level adaptation plans. We do a similar thing for disasters. We develop the global framework. That's then developed into national DRR strategies. Then it goes down to community-based DRR strategies. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We sectoralize that down. The problem is then you go down to the local authority level, the local government unit, as we call it in my language, and they are just overwhelmed by all these different frameworks coming down through them. You've got to think about climate change, you've got to think about DRI, you've got to think about, they just haven't got the capability or the resources to be able to integrate all these things effectively. It just doesn't work. We cannot get ahead of the curve when the horse is bolted. We're dealing with it downstream, and we don't have the resources downstream to do this integration that these frameworks work. So what you find is that, that we struggle to actually implement these frameworks. So you have national policies. In many countries I go to, we have beautiful national policies, but I go down to the local level, and actually there's not a lot happening. There just isn't the ability to get this coherence down there. But of course, the irony of all this is that when you go to the primary risk bearers, they understand risk in a much more holistic way. It's issues around livelihood security and jobs and health and those type of issues, and about assets. So people inherently understand these issues in a more holistic way, in a more integrated way. And the more that we bring the primary risk bearers into the equation, the closer that nexus comes, the stronger that integration comes. So if the challenge is how do we get better coherence and integration of these issues, the more we bring the primary risk bearers into this, the more likely we are to get that integration. And this happens also across the disaster management cycle. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether, at the moment, there's a big buzzword overseas is around what they call anticipatory action. So early action, our forecasting is getting better. So therefore, rather than respond, when our forecasts give us a degree of confidence that something is going to happen, let's preemptive action. We call it anticipatory action. It's very much the in thing at the moment. But of course, there's a whole framework now on a funding stream for anticipatory action, because this is ex ante pre-disaster activity. So we need separate funding for that. And then the response funding comes from, another pot of money for emergency contingencies. And then the recovery funding is in another pot of funding that comes through. And yet all these issues are not, they're not well integrated. The transitions are not there. I'll be really interested to see if the public inquiry on COVID is really trying to understand how well these transitions are working. How well did we build capacities, which meant we're in a better position, build back better further down the line? Those are the critical issues we should be discussing when we're looking at COVID. There's a lot of name throwing and blame placing at the moment, but actually how effective that was. How well did the response really facilitate an early recovery? We often say in the industry, don't we, that if you want to invest in better response, invest in preparedness. Most people go along with that. It intuitively sounds right. The way you design your response has a direct bearing on the effectiveness of your recovery. You need to be thinking about recovery as well as you're thinking about response. And how do you design a response that actually facilitates an early recovery? That continuum of thought, that integrated thinking, that's how people would be thinking about that intuitively. If they lost their family, they lost their possessions, how am I going to recover from this? Yes, I need basic needs, the food, the shelter, the blankets, but how am I going to recover from this? How am I going to get my house back? How am I going to get my job back? They'll be intuitively thinking about that at the same time. So how do we provide a response that facilitates that early recovery? So it was interesting, the UN Secretary General at the Davos conference this year, in his keynote address, his opening address at that, major global event, he said that, the critical issue really is that all these issues, it was a great wording, the challenges are more and more integrated, yet our responses are more and more fragmented. It is not that there isn't resource in the system. There is a lot of resource in the system, but the efficiency and the effectiveness gains are about how do you get the coherency and the integration and the synergies of these different aspects that we're working on. We need to get much better at using the available resource we have within the system. So that insight that we get, we as disaster managers, we see our societies knocked down. And what that does, when we stress our societies, when we shock our society, it invariably highlights the relative strengths and weaknesses. We call it capacities and vulnerabilities. It always highlights what are the critical vulnerabilities. It always highlights what are the critical interdependencies. It highlights what the limits and boundaries are. There are limits to how resilient we can be. There are limits to how adaptive we can be. We need to understand what those limits and thresholds are. We need to understand what those criticalities are in terms of interdependencies. We need to understand what those relative strengths and use that knowledge to feed back upstream into our development processes. This is partly about build back better, but the real critical issue is build better before. That's the holy grail. Build better before. And when we see our societies knocked down, we need to use that knowledge that we see as disaster managers and feed that up into our development processes. Has our experience of COVID brought about changes in our systems, our procedures, our policies? Are we seeing the knowledge and the learning captured, institutionalized, improving, adapting, continuous learning? Are we seeing that happening in our system? That's a resilient system. It's inherently a learning, adaptive, changing system that learns from experiences and takes it back upstream into our development. Build better before. And that means that it's not just about operating at sectoral level. I absolutely get we need to work at the local level. That is the foundation. And we sectoralize that through our local planning. I work with Kingston Council, where I live, and I work on their, local development plans. Of course, I'm working at that level. But it has to be empowered and actioned and mandated at a more strategic level, at the national strategy level. Because it's these development decisions, it's these investment decisions, at the national level, which can either cascade risk down the system or actually can cascade benefits down the system. So it's about working both at strategic national level as well as working at the operational level. And it's making sure our understanding of risk is brought into bear, is taken into account in those development processes. Of course, it's all of society. Of course, it's about, different actors have different responsibilities at different levels. Okay? So it's about getting the vertical coherence, the complementarity of action. We've forged a global Paris climate agreement. We then craft that into national policies. We then disseminate that down into local planning. It's this cascading down. And each time, at each level, there's different responsibilities for different departments, different actors, different divisions. So it's thinking systems, all the systems, as we were talking about earlier. It requires an enabling environment. It's a risk governance framework, essentially. There's different parts of this. Whole of society, particularly around people, culture, partnerships, collaboration. But it's about, you have to have the leadership, you have to have the policy mandate, the vision. I heard vision earlier on. You have to have the knowledge, the information, the tools, the institutional capacities. So all these issues are part of what's called the enabling environment. This is where the entry points are. I work overseas. We do a gaps and needs assessment of the enabling environment. We identify where the critical gaps are, where the entry points are to strengthen resilience, to strengthen risk-informed development. And then we develop a series of capacity-enhancing measures from there. So this is kind of, this is our systems approach to the way that we're trying to tackle this. So I'm nearly there. So I'm saying that, the risk is it's systemic. It's pushing the resilience agenda. It's not surprising that the UK has, for the first time, it's great. It now has a resilience framework, and we celebrate that. The challenge is really understanding what that prevention agenda means. It's more than preparedness. It's actually about thinking through our investment decisions. Are they risk-informed? Are we making the right choices that are putting us on a more sustainable development trajectory? That's vision, it's understanding, it's long-term. But it's recognizing risk is there. It's not about how we never want to avoid it, but turn it round. See it as the opportunity as well. Understand through a consensus, negotiated progress, what is acceptable. It's not so much about protecting development. We often think about disaster management is about how do we protect our development. The critical challenge is fundamentally how do we redefine our development. It's about redefining our development paradigm to a more sustainable development paradigm. It requires the enabling environment. It's a whole of society, whole of government, whole of system approach, but it has to be thought through in a coherent way. And it's about most of our tools that I look at are all about, understanding risk to something, risk to development. we really need to get better and designing approaches and tools and methodologies of understanding risk from development. So as we shift our thinking, we need to actually think more about what the relevant tools and processes we need to do this. Countries are getting it right. It's not all, what I'm talking about is not all relevant just to lower income countries. This is my last slide. Japan is, amongst my peers internationally, we kind of have a fair idea which are some of the most resilient societies in the world. Japan is probably one of the most resilient societies in the world. Interestingly, at the pre-Hyogo negotiations in around 1995, so that's what, over 25, 30 years ago, Japan put this model up of what their model was for resilience in Japan in 1995. They said it's about self-help. It's about people understanding what they can do, what their responsibilities are, what their duties are. It's about mutual assistance within your local neighborhood, within your local authorities, within your, extended networks. And then it's about government public support, about the government support. So that, Japan was thinking that approach 25, 30 years ago. And that to me is whole of society approach, systems approach. I mean, so those countries that have gone down that line, even though they're relatively high income countries, are deemed to be some of the most resilient countries, some of the most resilient nations, societies in our world today. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Mark.